Hi, folks. Good evening. It's Thinking Slow. This is the last video for the year. Yesterday's video is still up on YouTube, so we thought we'd make hay while the sun shines and do another one. This one is about critical care, and it's about the number that we hear over and over again. About 90% of critical care is being taken up by the unvaccinated. That's a statistic that's completely false, and we touched on it a couple of weeks ago. And in this short video, we want to show why it's false, what the talking heads that keep regurgitating that number actually use to arrive at that figure of 90%, and probably most importantly, what the statistics regulator has done about that. And the spoiler alert for that is very little is the answer. And then that leaves us questions about, what can we expect about the integrity of the system where there's basically no safeguards, where senior people in government can just stand up and make these outrageous claims, which can be parroted in the media, and essentially there's no consequence for that. And actually, just putting this thing up here, I know the consequence will probably be for us actually explaining what the numbers are and telling the truth. We will be the ones that will be shadow banned on Twitter and possibly have this deleted for having the nerve, the temerity to actually point out that our esteemed politicians are not telling the truth. And that's a very upside down world that we find ourselves in today. So let's go and see what these guys and girls have been up to with 90%. So I think the main thinking behind the 90% figure in intensive care is a basically totalitarian strategy that's sort of been variously attributed to Goebbels and to Lenin, that if you just keep repeating this often enough, it will become the truth, despite the fact objectively it's a flat-out lie. And this is repeated over and over and over again every single day. So in a way, this is sort of fighting the windmill, because the windmill is just a massive machine continually repeating this lie in order to vilify the unvaccinated and pressure the unvaccinated into getting the vaccine, and also to create friction and ill will between people. So the main idea is a totalitarian idea that you just keep repeating this over and over again until people believe it, although it's objectively untrue. So this is the beginning of the process. Our old friend who is Secretary of State for Digital Media and Culture, digital culture, media and sport is the correct title. As far as we can see, has no particularly discernible skills other than praising Boris Johnson, presumably with the objective of personal advancement. And her famous tweet was that there is no such thing as herd immunity. And that gives a flavour for this individual if you're not familiar with her. Here is the tweet. Basically, 90% of cases are in ICU are unvaccinated, and here's the anger. The doctors and the nurses are angry at those people. Clear message, again, that they're selfish. They're blocking up ICU units, and something needs to be done. And there's a link to an article here which is also somewhat interesting, although I don't pay money to this organization to read their misinformation. I prefer to find my own data. But so that was the sort of thing that's got the ball rolling. And then, magically this figure of 90% is everywhere, all over the press. It's all over, from this sort of supposedly left-wing press to the right-wing press to the press in the middle, everyone repeating the same misinformation over and over again, basically. So, as I said, this is a machine. It appears to be coordinated. The left and right side of this is a fallacy. It's just media pushing government propaganda, all shades of media. So before we get into 90%, we need to talk about, 90% of what. And we've quite often been asked a fair question, which is why we jump around between England, Wales, and Ireland when we're looking at statistics, and Scotland as well. But the reason for that is you can pick out the important bits from each of those nations, and Ireland, obviously a separate country. And essentially COVID will behave roughly the same way, plus minus, in those nations, because it's the same kind of population, the same weather, and we basically use statistics from each of them, not to cherry pick, but basically to find the bit of data that we need, and we can put together a sort of mosaic based on individual bits of data we can get from the nations. And this chart from Wales we use all the time because it's already ready, we don't need to redraw it. It's updated very regularly and it's quite informative, but we're using this as a proxy for England. The English chart we have to draw, we have it, but it doesn't. There's reasons why this is easier just to go through this. So 90% of what here is the basically light blue line. In Wales, this is about 20 people in critical care beds, which represents, roughly speaking, about 10% of the critical care capacity. And this long-term chart basically tells you that in December, when Nadine Dorries was making her comments, at least in Wales, you have these sort of 20 inpatients accounting for about 10% of total critical care capacity. So on a historic basis, that's very low, basically, low in absolute terms and low in percentage terms. So when we're fighting about 90% being unvaccinated, which isn't true, that's 90% of 10% utilization of critical care capacity. So, we're actually fighting over essentially a small pie. And the number for England is a little bit higher, but it's kind of similar, but the chart is not as informative as this one, which goes all the way back to March 2020. So that's what the 90% is about. And again, this is for critical care. It's not particularly high on a historic basis in Wales, and England is a roughly similar situation. So that was the scale of the question that we're talking about. Now, the crux of what the Secretary of State has done is to remarkably find a single unit within critical care, which you may not have heard of. Probably most people in the NHS haven't heard of it. It's called the Adult Extracorporeal Membrane Oxygenation Unit. And I have drawn on this chart the number of admissions into that unit, which we will call the ECMO to make it simpler. And I mean, you can see it really is. I mean, it's literally beyond belief, really. This unit, which does have a high share of unvaccinated in it, has somewhere about 30 odd admissions per month within a system which has around about 2,300 admissions per month. So this thing represents less than 1.3% of total ICU admissions. Now, you can call that cherry picking, but I mean, it's just ludicrous. And this is what goes on. This is what they do. They find a unit which matches the narrative and they push the narrative. This unit is tiny, and the makeup of patients in that unit has no relevance whatsoever to overall critical care. So this number is really, it's as close as you can get to lying as possible, basically. So this is what it actually is going on in overall critical care. This is from an organization called ICNARC, which produces a lot of data on critical care. There's quite a lot of ins and outs about what's the scope of their coverage, but the scope for this is essentially England, and this covers in total 8,393 admissions over this period from the 1st of May to the 15th of November. And this is a subset of what they cover in their overall report. I'm not a huge fan of these guys because they have basically sat on this data for as long as they possibly could. And in December, they were still referring back to ICU admissions up until July. So they had this data, but they were sitting on it. Now it's been released. But basically, this green bar here is the share of ICU admissions by month, which is unvaccinated. And you can see from here, basically from October, the unvaccinated have been less than half of ICU admissions. So, again, that is highlighting how unrepresentative that 90% number that Nadine Dorries was talking about. It's basically double the real number, which applies to the whole of the ICU system. And this actually represents reality. And the number that they have is basically, a ludicrous cherry pick, because the sample that they took was so small for such a small, unrepresentative unit, and that is basically the crux of what they've done. And before wrapping up some conclusions for that, I wanted to make clear that if anyone had really any interest, any of these people, the Secretary of State had any interest in the truth, or any of those media talking heads, they could have put any kind of analyst or researcher on to have a quick rummage around to see, is this realistic, 90%? And they would have known relatively quickly that it's not realistic. We looked at Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. They do publish ICU admissions data by vaccination status. You could see, and we actually produced this data in November, and we said basically around about 45% of ICU admissions will not have had a vaccine. That was our estimate based on public disclosure in Ireland, and I'll provide a link to that. It does take a little bit of getting, but it's not that big a deal. That was our estimate, 45%, and look at the real number, 47.5% was the number that was finally released, and this was released after we made our 45% estimate. So we knew in November, looking at Ireland, that it's likely that unvaccinated would be around about here, leaving 55% having being vaccinated with 1 or 2 doses. So if anybody actually was interested in establishing the truth or providing numbers or data that reflected reality, they could have done that. They have access to research budgets, research analysts, and everything else. If we can do it, they can do it. They just don't want to do it, basically, is the answer. So, let's look at the role of the regulator in all this, because there is a statistics regulator, there is a code, and they are supposed to wade in when the code has been breached. I've got the code here in front of me. Basically, it's a question of integrity, professionalism. The statistics must be reliable. They shouldn't be selectively released. Now, basically, in this case, everything that was done was in breach of that code. Everything. The data that Dorries was referring to was selectively released. It wasn't made available to the public. That small 1.3% unit, of course, the ECMO unit, that's not public information. So that was breached in the code. But the real crux of what was breached is these people are knowingly using a unit that does not reflect the overall situation in intensive care. In fact, it completely misrepresents the overall situation in intensive care. So you couldn't really get a bigger breach of the statistics code than this case. And the regulator's response was, oh, okay, there's been another tweet issued, so that kind of closes this off. And okay, they published the data on this ECMO unit, so that's essentially the end of story. Now look at the correction. This is the corrected tweet. they've just added, this wording in here, the most specialist care. That's all. So again, this is completely unrepresentative, and it's just sort of swept under the carpet by adding in a bit of weasel wording. Now this is really what's going on here. Basically, this is tick the box kind of regulation. There's no wading in. There's no getting serious about implementing the code. There's a little slap on the wrist, a new tweet with a weasel word added in, and that's it. Job done, basically. And this is why the system is out of control. Basically, there isn't really serious regulation in here. I mean, it's a value judgment, but I see this as pathetic, because this guy, who's the Director General of Regulation, has signed this code. This code has basically been completely ignored in this situation, and he's come up with such a weak sanction of a second tweet with a weasel word, and then actually publishing the data on this small unit. Okay, publishing the data was useful because we could get hold of it, but that's about it. This is very weak, allowing a Secretary of State to make this kind of misleading tweet, which is then massively repeated through mass media, and doing very little about it, we find pretty poor, to be honest. And it indicates why the system is really out of control. There's no real forceful regulation or oversight here that's stopping this. It's just a weak slap on the wrist, and let's just move on, basically. This is very, very disappointing from our point of view. So, and then, what happens next is, of course, we know there's a narrative. The narrative must be maintained, and we know that when they can't find a tiny unit like ECMO, which is completely unrepresentative, they will just manipulate the definitions. And we've put out some videos about the manipulation of what the word unvaccinated actually means, because it includes people that are vaccinated. And then you just keep playing with definitions, ad nauseum, basically, to maintain the narrative. And, here's another example. This is from NHS Richmond. They decided to invent this term, not fully vaccinated. So they basically have now decided fully vaccinated means 3 doses. So all of a sudden, effectively, on this date, the 16th of December, they put a line through all the double dose vaccinated, called them not fully vaccinated, and then reset the clock back to 0, and then produced this also misleading tweet that 90% of hospital patients are not fully vaccinated. Now we know, again, from Wales that 85% of inpatients are vaccinated, and this is just more weasel wording, more dissembling, more dishonesty. You just play with the definitions and generate the number you want, basically. And this is going to go on ad nauseum, basically. And our glorious Prime Minister has also just done an interview saying the critical care units are full of, I think he did actually use the word unboosted, but again, it's the same concept. You just basically change the goalposts, redefine everything, and set everything to 0, and just make it up as you go along, essentially. And this will be the next joke term that they come up with, unboosted. So, wrapping up, as I said, what's going on clearly is there's a message, and we are getting into these more and more totalitarian type processes where the people need to be pushed into doing something. So it's all about messaging, and then the facts in inverted commas are essentially just invented around the message. As I said, this was a clear case of choosing this unrepresentative unit, ECMO, and just using that, although it completely misrepresents what's going on in the overall ICU. And then, of course, you have this unlimited scope for dishonesty around the definitions, and that's something we've seen a lot of. And then, the people driving this process are literally, they are literally neo-Marxists. If you look at the membership of the main SAGE committee, which is SPY B, the most outspoken member of that committee, Comrade Michi, openly admires China. She has written tweets praising the Chinese system and criticizing the broken neoliberal democracy of the UK. Now, these guys are running policy, and that this is where this is coming from. We are implementing and borrowing totalitarian population management systems and using them. And then we get to the mainstream media, I don't remember, it's the fourth estate or the fifth estate. But this is also a joke, they're supposed to be different sides of the political spectrum, but they're all repeating this 90%. It goes from the chairman of the Spectator to the Mirror to all stops in between. The media is fully on board with just echoing the government message, and a lot of that probably has to do with the money, the unbelievable amounts of money the government is spending on all this propaganda, which is obviously going to the media and propping the media up. But it's, they will repeat the government message: be afraid, do as you're told, get vaccinated, and they will use the figures like 90% in order to pressurize the unvaccinated, even though it's completely untrue, and with a minimal amount of research they know it's untrue. So that's really the conclusion, from this talk, that the system is kind of broken. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this post-truth world, but we're certainly in it. It's coming from the top, it's coming from the government, and the spooky thing about it is it's going to be us that will be deleted. These guys can tweet out 90% till they're blue in the face. There won't be any comeback from the social media platform. There won't be any comeback from any kind of regulator, maybe the tiniest slap on the wrist that we saw here, which was really pretty pathetic, to be honest. It will be us who will be deleted. We're already shadow banned. We've had material deleted on the YouTube channel and so on and so forth. But we've actually presented you the data. We've explained what these guys have been up to, and we will be deleted, not them. This is where we are today, basically. Be careful. So I wanted to just wrap up for 2021, and here's something you may not have seen or heard. It's Legal Man. It's a US perspective. He's just done an episode on brainwashing, and he's America's favorite lawyer, which is a self-certified title that he gave himself. And it's semi-light-hearted, but it's also a serious subject. I mean, you have to stay slightly light-hearted on this stuff. But if you haven't listened, it's quite good. Basically, I would have a listen. So that's a small plug for them. I think and this is about media brainwashing and how big it is. It's a machine, and it's not going anywhere, basically. So thank you very much for listening. This is a quote we like a lot. Basically, this is history. This is what happens. Everything's for our safety. It's for our own good. Just do as you're told. And as we wrap up every show, don't stay safe, but stay free. Because staying free is really ultimately the only way to stay safe. And it's disappointing that there's so many people in England who are happy to be scared and want the government to protect them. I mean, they obviously have no clue about the history of totalitarianism and how much protection you get when you're not free. But that's the reality. There are a good number of those people, unfortunately, and this struggle is not going anywhere. If you value freedom, you're going to have to fight for it, basically, unfortunately. Not physically, but in the political sense. So anyway, good luck to everyone in 2022, and let's stay free. Thank you very much. Goodbye.